Hey guys, today we are going to talk about the real crazy life of medieval peasants and how hard their life was and working in gardens, so you can leave your phone near and sleep while listening to this chilling story. But before that, please subscribe our channel for more content like this. Thank you. In the dim light before dawn, the air is cold and still around the small cottage at the edge of the village. Inside, the peasant stirs awake on his straw-filled pallet and dresses in layers of coarse linen and wool, pulling a patched cloak tight about his shoulders. He kneels by the hearth and adds a few large logs to the embers, ensuring the morning fire will burn strongly throughout the day. Outside in the yard, the peasant carries wooden buckets of water from the well. His breath puffs in the chilly air as he trudges, the bucket swinging at his side. He pours water into the feed troughs and bowls for the farm animals. The goats and chickens awaken and bleat softly as he splashes water for them. He then leads a goat out from the cool stable for the morning milking. Sitting on a three-legged wooden stool, he gently milks the goat into a metal pail with experienced hands. The rhythmic drip of milk into the bucket is one of the day's first tasks, each drop precious. Some of this warm milk will be saved and churned into butter or cheese, while the rest will enrich the morning porridge. Next, he checks the small chicken coop attached to the cottage. He scatters a handful of last night's leftover grain for the hens and collects any newly laid eggs. He finds a few speckled eggs nestled in the straw and gathers them carefully into a wooden bowl. Each egg is turned gently in his hands and tucked into the bowl. Protein and good fortune that must not be wasted. After the animals are fed and watered and the chores complete, he washes his hands on the cold kitchen stone. The small fire now hangs over the cauldron of boiling water. With urgency, he ladles the mixture into a wooden bowl and then douses coarse rye bread into the thin gruel to soften it. By the time the eastern sky begins to lighten, the first meal of the day is ready. He sits on a low stool beside the table and eats his simple breakfast in silence. The meal is sparse, coarse bread dipped in weak porridge, possibly with a few wilted herbs sprinkled on top, but he chews each bite quickly and deliberately, mindful of the morning's work ahead. His stomach growls even as he eats. There is little else to sustain him until evening. There is no time for idle conversation. He rises before the meal is even finished and washes it down with a sip of cool water from a jar. Daylight is precious in these months, and he knows the garden will not tend itself. After this small meal, he drags on his worn leather boots and steps outside into the crisp morning air. Every step on the frost-hardened ground sends a little cloud of steam puffing from his boots. He rubs the sleep from his eyes and surveys the garden near the cottage, which lies just beyond a woven fence of thin saplings. The earth in the narrow beds is still dark and cool, with patches of frozen soil clinging in clumps. He squeezes the parched soil between fingers to feel its moisture. Near the gateway, dew still clings to the wires of an old fence. He pats it dry and crosses himself in thanks that no frost killed the tender shoots. Before he begins digging, he looks around at his small domain, the smoke curling from the cottage chimney, his children's straw mattresses poking out a window, and the first pale rays of dawn on distant fields. He glances skyward. The faint pink of sunrise promises at least several clear hours ahead. He steels himself and strides to the lean-to beside the house where his tools are stored. There lie the instruments of his craft. A heavy spade with an iron blade, its handle worn smooth by years of use, a stout hoe with a sharp edge, a short-handled rake, and a small sharpened sickle for herbs. He picks up each tool in turn to feel its weight and balance, mentally preparing for the labor to come. In the first full light of dawn, he stands amid his garden with spade and hoe in hand. He drives the iron spade blade into the dark, cool earth and heaves hard, twisting his torso to turn the soil. A large clod lifts and then breaks apart with a dull thud. Sweat already beads on his brow despite the morning chill. The earth is cold and tenacious, and each thrust tests his strength. He stands back for a moment, breathing heavily, surveying the long strip of ground he has just turned. The line of broken soil is deeper and looser now, ready to be prepared further. He presses on. Each time he lifts the spade, he lets gravity drop the loosened dirt back into the furrow. This aerated earth is good for planting, but he still must clear it of stones and roots. Kneeling on a small wooden pad, he uses the short-handled hoe to break any stubborn clumps, flattening them into finer dirt. Sticks, pebbles, and old roots fall loose under each strike, and he tosses them aside. Over by the garden edge, he piles the refuse and will later burn or compost it. He finds a rounded river stone in the clay and sets it aside. Even a medium stone could hinder a carrot's growth if left behind. The soil in the row now looks dark and crumbly, each piece small enough that seeds can easily take root. He stands and runs his hand along the furrow's length, checking for hidden obstacles. Even as he plants, he remains alert. A brittle root of last year's weeds or a misplaced stone could derail new growth. Walking the furrow, he comes across a patch of compacted earth caused by an animal's hoof last week. Stepping cautiously, he thrusts the blade of his hoe into the dense soil and forces it free bit by bit. He then spreads it smooth with the hoe, double-checking that nothing remains to block the young sprouts. In the raised plot behind him, he notices a ladybug crawling on a leaf, a good sign, since many are the gardener's friends in this world of pestilence. Next, he spreads a handful of aged cow dung or compost across the row. The pungent smell rises in his face as he crumbles clumps between his fingers. Despite the foul odor, he knows the importance. This black manure is full of nutrients that the spring planting will need. He flips the spade again and again, mixing the rich material evenly into the furrow. As the shovelful of manure and soil tumbles together, he hears the hollow sound of metal hitting an empty spot and smiles. Bit by bit, he's made the earth more fertile than it was. The rich, dark ground begins to glisten slightly with moisture from the dung. After several passes, the fertilizer is buried deep enough that it will sink into the soil with the morning rains. He pauses for a moment, leaning on the handle of his spade and catching his breath. His shirt is damp with sweat now. He takes a deep drink from his leather water pouch, grateful for the cool relief. The day is warming already, even this early. As he wipes his mouth on his sleeve, he rubs his arms and torso under the cloth, loosening knots of tension. His muscles burn from bending and lifting, but he will have no rest until the seeds are sown. There are still long hours of labor ahead. Brushing the sweat from his eyes, he tightens his grip and turns back to the ground. He knows the proper spacing of each vegetable by heart after years of practice. With the beans sown, he moves to carrots. He digs a straight, shallow furrow and lightly drops the tiny carrot seeds in a line. These he covers with a finer combing of soil, being careful not to bury them too deep. Next, he plants a row of onions from small bulbs, setting each one just below the surface so its green top will soon reach up. Finally, he plants a few lettuces and spinach leaves near the edge. Each leaf is placed gently so as not to tear its stems. After filling each bed with the proper seeds, he covers the last seeds with earth and uses the back of his heel to tamp the ground flat. This careful pressing removes any pockets of air around the seeds. and he knows from experience that such contact with the moist soil helps them sprout. Between the beds, he lays a thick path of dry straw, pulled from a bundle near the barn. The golden straw covers the bare soil between the rows. By mulching these paths, he will suppress weeds and slow evaporation. He spreads straw generously along each row now planted, making neat borders. The straw is coarse and prickles his hands, but this simple act will save him hours of work pulling weeds later. With each handful he places, he reflects that a small effort now means fewer weeds choking the crops in weeks to come. Already the garden looks tidier. The dark soil rows stand out sharply against the light straw borders. As mid-morning approaches, his back aches and his breath comes faster. He is sweating through his tunic, yet the sunlight continues to climb. His arms shake slightly as he switches from planting to scanning what he has done. He takes a moment to test the soil's moisture by squeezing a fistful. It crumbles just right, not too wet, not bone dry, a sign that his timing of the past rainfall has been fortunate. Occasionally, he sneezes from the dust and brushes cobwebs from the corners of the garden frames. A small itch behind his ear reminds him to rub the sweat from his eyes again. This constant motion, dig, plant, cover, press, is the steady rhythm of his life today. The monotony is exhausting, but necessary. He pushes hunger to the back of his mind and focuses only on the task at hand. He checks the newly sown beds once more. In a bed of carrots, he notices several seedlings from the previous year were left behind. They are tiny but already crowding one another, so he carefully thins them by plucking the weakest. In a row of lettuce, one plant leans too close to its neighbor. He uproots it gently and replants it a handspan over. These small corrections ensure the plants will not stunt each other's growth. The discipline of spacing and thinning has been learned from many seasons. He knows even a few overcrowded seeds can reduce the harvest significantly. Finally, he pauses to survey the orderly patchwork of the garden. The furrows he has tilled lie straight, and every available clump of turned earth holds seeds or small plants. The work of this morning has nearly created a new miniature farm. He runs a hand along his back, which is sore from bending, and is satisfied at the neat rows he has made. Each section is marked by purpose. Not a single patch is wasted. He picks up one more handful of seeds from his pouch and sows the final row of parsnips. With the last seed in place and covered, he steps back once more and watches the garden under the growing sun. Midday. Break and maintenance. By now the sun stands high overhead. The peasant props his tools against the fence and takes a well-deserved break. He sits on a flat wooden bench near the garden and unwraps a bit more rye bread from a cloth. Into this, he dips the leftover pottage from the morning, a thin broth of peas and herbs. The lukewarm stew is humble, but he eats it slowly. Each bite must count. Every swallow is mindful. The meal is eaten in silence. Sweat drips from his hairline, and his back stiffens as he leans forward with fatigue. He sets to work again. Every few paces back in the garden, he bends low to inspect the plants. Already a few stubborn weeds have sprouted in the newly worked soil. He pulls each by hand or strikes it with the hoe before it can grow any larger. Even a short stop in weeding could allow nettles or burdock to steal precious nutrients, so he moves carefully down the row. At his feet, he has a small basket for waste. Weeds, roots, and clumps of mud are emptied into it as he goes. His fingers are raw from this repeated grip and tug, but he works steadily to leave no weed standing. Checking the crops themselves, he finds evidence of pests. In one row of brassicas, a large green caterpillar has chewed ragged holes in a few leaves. Without hesitation, he pinches the damaged leaf to remove it and tosses the pest into the grass. Along the cabbage stem, he finds a cluster of smaller bugs. He flicks each one into the dirt. In the herb patch, a snail slides away under a leaf. He picks it off and crushes it with the toe of his boot. The battle against pests is never ending. Every leaf must be inspected and every pest dealt with, no matter how small. The midday heat intensifies, but he will not relent. To win even this small struggle means more food in the pot later. As the clock approaches the afternoon, he straightens his back one last time. His clothes are soaked through, his hands streaked with mud. For now, the short respite and quick vigil is over. His stomach clenches in protest, but he pushes the hunger aside with a last sip of water. He looks at the open sky and knows there are still hours of daylight to work. With the brief pause complete, he shoulders his spade and turns to the next section of the garden, prepared to continue the labor until the sun begins to fade. Afternoon chores and harvesting. By mid-afternoon, the peasant's muscles throb, but the sun is still high, and there is work to be done. He begins by gathering the most vulnerable benefits of the garden while he still can. In one corner, a small patch of snow peas and broad beans have fattened their pods under the sun. He carefully removes a handful of these pods and drops them into a woven basket. The green salad from the edge bed joins them, a few lettuce leaves and tender spinach. Each of these will be a welcome addition to tonight's dinner, adding some freshness to the stale bread and pottage. As a small reward for his toil, he pops a single pea out of its pod and tastes it, sweet and earthy, a tiny relief for his empty stomach. He stoops to test a different patch. Reddish roots peek from the soil. One is a radish, round and ready to harvest. He pulls it free and brushes it clean. The radish gives a satisfying crunch as he bites off a piece, its peppery taste invigorating him. He stores the rest of the radish in the basket with the others. Then he notices some chives and parsley growing near the fence. He cuts a small bunch of the herbs and adds them as well. These aromatic greens will flavor the evening stew. For medieval peasants, the garden was not a hobby but a necessity for survival. Every planted seed was a hope against hunger. Every pest removed a battle against starvation. Work, meal, and rest repeat day after day, year after year, with the weather and luck deciding how much food will come. There is no variation except that the seasons and storms intervene. If a drought or a harsh frost strikes at the wrong time, a family could be left with almost nothing to eat, and their winter stores emptied far too soon. Each successful season is a blessing, each failure a disaster that echoes in every empty pot. Even as he lies down to sleep, the peasant knows tomorrow will follow the same cycle: dawn chores, back-breaking labor, scant meals, and fitful rest before the sun rises again. His life is measured in dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his hands. The garden provides the family's only real nutrition, but it also highlights their insecurity. One bad harvest can destroy all this work in a moment. He also remembers that much of what he tends will be given away as taxes and rent. The lord of the manor and the church take their share. So even if the harvest is good, what he keeps for his family can be only a fraction of the yield. The rest belongs to another, leaving his household with barely enough to survive. It's the year 1179. Winter has come early to northern France. The wind screeches through the skeletal remains of once lush forests. The ground is frozen solid. Your boots crunch the snow as you walk. You're a knight, the elite of the medieval world. You wear a suit of steel, forged by fire and faith. But tonight, it's not swords you fear, it's the cold. We imagine knights as invincible warriors, cloaked in glory, armed to the teeth, and surrounded by stone walls and loyal squires. But what happens when the warmth of battle is replaced by the bitterness of frost? How did these armored men survive nights where temperatures dropped below freezing? When snow covered the land and warmth was a luxury. This is not just a history lesson, it's a journey into the bone-chilling realities of medieval survival. We'll break the myths, reveal the secrets, and show how even the mightiest of knights could fall, not by sword, but by winter's hand. To understand how knights survived the cold, we must first understand the cold itself. From the 5th to the 15th century, Europe experienced fluctuations in climate. While much of this period saw mild temperatures, the latter centuries ushered in what scientists now call the Little Ice Age. It wasn't glacial, but it was bitter. Winters grew longer, harsher, deadlier. Monks often wrote of white death, years where crops failed and snow covered the fields for weeks. Snowdrifts could bury entire villages, rivers froze, and in the mountains, even the strongest men risked death just traveling. Knights, for all their armor and training, were still men. And when the wind howled through the cracks of even the strongest castle, the difference between life and death could be as simple as a woolen tunic. So how did they protect themselves? The answer: layers. Beneath the iconic armor were layers of warmth: linen shirts, woolen trousers, thick socks, a gambeson, padded armor that was not only for protection, but also insulation. Then came the chainmail hauberk. Cold to the touch, but once warmed by the body, it helped retain heat. Over that, a surcoat, often made of heavy wool or lined with fur. Cloaks were essential. A good cloak could mean the difference between a shivering watch shift and a warm patrol. Cloaks were fastened with brooches and sometimes waxed to keep out the snow. Gloves were leather or fur-lined. Boots were often stuffed with straw or wool. Helmets might be lined with padded coifs, which doubled as warmth and head protection. Steel may protect against blades, but against frost, it was wool, fur, and fire that kept death at bay. A knight's best defense against the cold wasn't armor, it was shelter. Inside castles, warmth was a luxury unevenly distributed. The great halls, where nobles dined and warriors gathered, were heated by massive fireplaces, but private rooms? Often icy. Tapestries were not just decorations, they were insulation. Hung from stone walls, they helped trap heat. Floors were covered with rushes, straw, or furs. Even beds were layered, mattresses stuffed with feathers, covered in wool, and topped with animal pelts. But what if there was no castle? Campaigns didn't pause for winter. Armies had to adapt. Tents were used, reinforced with cloaks and lined with straw. Campfires were built strategically, sometimes dug into the earth to avoid detection and wind. Knights relied heavily on their squires and comrades. Body heat, shared blankets, even sleeping in armor if ambush was possible. The cold didn't just test the body, it tested loyalty, discipline, and morale. Cold was not the only enemy of the medieval knight. Hunger could strike just as hard, and to stay warm, you had to stay fed. Calories were fuel. A knight's winter diet focused on sustenance. Hot pottage, a thick stew made of grains, vegetables, sometimes meat, salted pork, smoked fish, flatbread, ale or mulled wine warmed by the fire. Fire wasn't just comfort, it was life. In castles, large hearths burned day and night. In camps, Fires had to be carefully placed, shielded from wind, hidden from enemies. Sometimes fires were dug into pits or placed behind walls of packed snow. Nights adapted. Heated stones were placed in bedding. Animal fats rubbed on skin to prevent frostbite. Cloaks were wrapped like sleeping bags. Rationing was critical. Starvation could destroy morale faster than the cold. Leadership had to ensure supplies lasted the season, or risk rebellion and desertion. Fire, food, and fortitude. These were the knight's real weapons against winter. Survival was more than armor and stew. It was also a matter of medicine and myth. Cold injuries like frostbite, chilblains, and hypothermia were common. And while medical science was primitive by today's standards, medieval knowledge wasn't entirely ineffective. Warming salves made from goose fat and herbs were rubbed into hands and feet. Wool soaked in wine was used as insulation and treatment. Hygiene mattered more than most think. Knights and nobles often bathed, not daily, but regularly, especially in winter when illness could spread in confined quarters. Monasteries often acted as medical centers. Monks documented symptoms and remedies, blending classical knowledge with local traditions. Health wasn't just about healing. It was about prevention, cleanliness, warmth, and watching for the signs before it was too late. When snow blanketed the earth and the nights grew long, many armies chose to wait. But not all wars could afford to pause. Winter warfare was rare, but when it happened, it was brutal. Medieval campaigns were dictated by seasons. Spring and summer were ideal for movement and supply. Autumn was for harvesting. Winter, it was for enduring. But there were exceptions. In 1242, on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, Russian and Teutonic forces clashed in what became known as the Battle on the Ice. Steel met ice, and many drowned when armor broke through the brittle surface. Knights struggled in winter battles. Horses lost footing. Archers' strings snapped from the cold. Armor stiffened. Fingers froze on hilts. The terrain itself was the deadliest foe. In Scandinavia and the Baltic, some troops used skis or snowshoes. Others dragged supplies on sledges. Armies moved slower, more cautiously, using forests for cover, rivers as frozen highways, and mountains as walls against attack. Sieges in winter were rare, but devastating. Fires had to be hidden. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Defenders would use snow and ice to their advantage, flooding trenches and letting them freeze solid. The ingenuity of winter tactics was matched only by the desperation. Some commanders used the cold as a weapon, attacking supply lines, burning winter stores, forcing surrender by starvation. A knight's bravery was tested not just in battle, but in the waiting, in holding a frozen line, in keeping men warm, fed, and focused while the world turned white and hope thinned like breath in cold air. We remember the knight for his sword, his armor, his code, but survival, in the depths of winter, required a different kind of strength. It was in the cold, in silence, in hunger, that the true battle was fought, not with enemy blades, but with nature itself, with loneliness, with fear, with fatigue. They survived because they adapted, layered their garments, fortified their walls, shared warmth and fire. They honored discipline and valued preparation, and above all, they endured. Today, when winter comes, we light a switch, turn a dial, and forget what it means to truly endure the cold. But once, not so long ago, survival was earned, one frozen breath at a time. And the knight, steel-clad and stoic, remained not because he was fearless, but because he was prepared. How medieval knights survived the coldest nights. Winter crept over medieval Europe like an unwelcome specter. No amount of shining armor or legendary bravery could ward off the numbing chill. The first frosts and snowy winds shattered the myth of knightly invincibility. Even a battle-hardened knight could not charge through a blizzard. In fact, war was mostly a summer affair. Medieval armies typically broke camp as fields froze over, because horses needed grazing and dirt roads turned to mud. The approach of winter meant a stark reminder that the battlefield could wait. Nature would be the real opponent. For a knight, survival would depend not just on swordplay, but on clothing, shelter, fire, food, and sheer willpower. Medieval people knew the challenge all too well. Before modern heating, staying warm required fire, which meant burning wood, and no gas or oil furnaces awaited them. Only the richest could afford the novelty of chimneys. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Louis VII in 1137, she famously insisted on installing fireplaces in his chilly castles. Until then, everyone, lords and serfs alike, huddled around open hearths. These great halls had a single central fire pit under a hole in the roof. Smoke filled the room. It was called the perfume of the day, and stone walls held the cold. Even nobles woke up covered with ash. By night, the hearth was often banked under a clay cover to prevent sparks. The winter cold demanded respect. Beneath gleaming plate and mail, a knight could still freeze solid without proper care. As the first snow began to fall, the stage was set. The romantic image of a knight astride a white charger was a fantasy. In truth, those same knights now traded triumphal banners for woolen capes and fireside vigilance. Next, we will see how they dressed against the freeze. Layered for war and winter, clothing and linings. Knights survived winter by becoming layering experts. Underneath their armor, they built an insulated fortress of fabric. First came a tight linen shirt, a wicking underlayer, then a heavy wool tunic atop it. Each garment trapped warm air. Over this might go a padded gambeson or arming doublet, a quilted wool jacket that served as primitive body armor and a deep insulating layer. On top of the gambeson, a knight could wear more wool or linen layers, a mid-length surcoat or tunic, and then an overgown or long cloak, often thick wool. A hood might be attached to the cloak, or he'd don a separate cap. Headgear was essential. Knights knew to never neglect their crown. Hats are a must, since a hot body will shunt heat to the head otherwise, leaving feet and fingers numb. Under their boots, they stuffed straw and rags for extra insulation, a trick even common folk used for winter warmth. Fur was a knight's secret weapon. He might don layers of rabbit, marten or squirrel fur, or even lambskin lining according to rank and wealth. Contemporary accounts note that a well-dressed noble might wear 3 different furs at once if necessary. Sumptuary laws reserved ermine for royalty, but coarse furs kept many a knight alive. Over all the wool and leather, he often threw a heavy sheepskin cloak. Chronicles and inventories mention sheepskin cloaks. In winter, to keep out the cold and rain. A thick hooded cloak of wool or fur became the final barrier against wind. One imagine a knight layering up. First linen, then a quilted cotton gambeson, topped with wool, then leather-reinforced boots and gloves, crowned by a fur-lined cloak and a wool cap. He might tighten straps to seal air gaps and tuck layers into gaps between plate and mail. Even so, cloth could only do so much. How then did their hard steel armor fare in the frost? Steel and cold, armor under winter's grip. Heavy armor could be a curse as well as a shield against winter. In theory, metal plates conduct heat away from the body, and an empty shell of armor in the snow would be frigid. But knights never wore bare steel. Under every piece of plate or mail was the gambeson. This thickly padded arming coat covered the entire torso, arms, and often the thighs as well, giving a knight layers of wool against both blows and cold. The gambeson's dense quilting insulated against cold and heat, acting like a military-grade winter coat. With hands and legs also padded by thick woolen habergeon or quilted chausses, only the face and fingers might peek out past mail and gauntlets, and these were muffled in hoods and gloves. Medieval armorers knew winter would come. In northern lands, it was common to adjust armor for the cold. Chroniclers note that in colder regions, knights simply padded up. Thicker gambesons and additional layers of wool were used, and even removable linings were fitted inside breastplates to retain heat. A knight might add a second gambeson under his first, or don woolen arming hoods beneath helmets. Even the design of plates left room for collars of fur or leather at the neck to stop drafts. Some helmets had padded liners, and leather straps were often covered in cloth or fur. In short, if the horse's metal shoes could bite ice, so could the knight's armor. But thanks to generous padding, the steel usually stayed a buffer, not an ice conductor. It's said that a well-padded gambeson could even deflect a lighter sword blow, or arrow 7, and at the same time, it kept body heat in. In long marches through snow, the weight of armor was tiring, but at least it didn't freeze him. Of course, if a knight stripped off his mail to get warm, he relied entirely on cloth. There are anecdotes of men warming themselves by taking just cuirass or helmets off. Try that in January. But generally, armor helped anchor all the layers snugly. When night fell, many removed heavy greaves and helmets first, to settle by the fire with freer movement. Even so, not every inch could be armored. By winter's onset, belts or gaiters were loosened to prevent chafing from swollen joints. Gauntlets and leather surcoats kept limbs warm, even if plates were removed. A full suit of mail, or plate, was like an insulating tent around the body, with the gambeson as the inner lining, so knights could bear far more cold on duty than a lightly clad soldier. Yet beneath it all was still flesh. Under the biggest winter storms, even a fully armored knight would crave a hearth. Next, we'll leave the knight's gear and look at the castles and tents that sheltered him from the wind. Castle halls and camp shelters, keeping out the wind. When frost and snow fell, knights sought the best shelter available. In a rich lord's castle, house barn halls held the family, and sometimes animals together under one roof for warmth. Stone walls were thick but cold, so nobles hung tapestries and filled rooms with straw lining to insulate against drafts. Medieval accounts note how tapestry and rushes on the floor were used to keep heat in the keep. Or great hall, the central hearth was king. A roaring fire pumped as much warmth as a single furnace could manage blazed day and night. Bathhouses and kitchens were often the warmest spots. Even so, wealth and rank mattered. The highest nobles might retire to private solar chambers with fireplaces by the mid-1200s, but many others still slept in the smoky common hall. They piled on blankets and skins to keep the chill off. Knights would enter wrapped in their furs, then cast heavy capes over the back of a bench or throne. Some kept a small footstool fire burning in the corner, essentially a makeshift brazier to keep their boots and feet from freezing. Heated stones were even used. One medieval tip was to bake a flat stone in the oven or hearth, wrap it in cloth, and slide it into the bedding to warm the sheets. If no stone fort was at hand, say on campaign, knights turned to their own camps. Tents were usually thick wool or canvas pavilions, sometimes wooden huts hastily built. For winter campaigns, reenactment guides recommend reinforcing tent poles, clearing snow, and insulating the floor. Knights might lay down layers of straw or animal hides as bedding. In some northern armies, a house was built of wood. In snowy forests, a trench might be dug, with timber roof and sod cover to hold heat. Wherever they slept, every effort was made to keep wind and snow at bay. Flaps secured, grommets sealed with beeswax, even double walls of cloth suggested by modern reenactors. Air between them acts as insulation. Inside tents, fire was handled cautiously. A risky but common solution was a central fire bowl set on stones or clay blocks. This pit, kept just deep and wide enough for coals, radiated heat like a primitive stove. Proper ventilation, a chimney flap or opening overhead, was a must to avoid smoke suffocation. If that was too dangerous, portable braziers were the norm. A metal bucket or trough filled with hot coals served as a movable heater. Knights would huddle close, arms over the rim of the brazier while mugging for warmth. Oil or animal fat lamps gave off small amounts of heat, besides the obvious illumination, but often filled a tiny tent with choking smoke. In any case, fires in camp were tended ceaselessly. Men would take turns feeding them so that the last guard wouldn't freeze. At night, when half-frozen knights bundled into cold tents or barns, they sometimes took a lesson from later medieval lore, slipping a hot iron or brick wrapped in cloth between the blankets. This primitive electric blanket could keep the bed warm for an hour or two. But mostly, the trick was human. Knights would share beds, or at least lie as close together as armor permitted, pooling body heat under furs. Even animals played a part. War horses and pack mules might be stabled or chained close by a big campfire, their breathing adding warmth. In peasant villages, families slept with cows for heat. A lord's horse couldn't quite fit in the keep, but it was led into the courtyard by the hearth. Whether in castle or camp, shelter was never perfect. Damp walls and muddy floors still soaked through fabric. The cold crept in through crevices, gaps in shutters, cracks in stone. Cloth boots and gloves were quickly worn through by ice and sweat. By late night, a knight's bed was a nest of furs and straw, which he prayed would hold body heat. But after shelter, warmth required fire, and that took fuel, ingenuity, and constant tending. Fireside tactics. Building and using heat. Wood was a knight's best ally against winter. Castles stored cordwood all year, and armies on the march burned their way through forests. In some regions, coal was known. 14th century England was starting to dig it. But mostly wood, turf, or dried animal dung were the fuels. The trick was to make each spark count. Knights learned to maximize what heat they had, closing curtains, stopping drafts, and hanging blankets around fireplace openings. All nobles kept fire pokers and shovels at hand so they could bank hot coals during lulls and stir them back to life in the morning. At mealtime, big cauldrons of stewing broth were kept on the fire all day. The evaporating steam carried warmth through halls. A kitchen crew might keep a succession of kettles going. The last pot eventually filled with gruel or thick ale used to heat the master's chamber overnight. Castles often had a buttery or bakehouse separate from the hall. The residual heat from baking bread and roasting meat would warm up adjacent rooms when doors were open. In cold European climates, one medieval trick was to heat the very floor. Floors were sometimes lined with bricks above shallow flues so that the hearth's fire sent gentle heat upward. The Romans had hypocausts. Some medieval inns copied the idea with burning clay ovens under stone slabs. In a siege or on campaign, primitive stoves were used. Iron or clay containers, sometimes portable like chests of iron plates, were filled with red-hot coals and placed in tents or field huts. Knights gathered around these stoves, warming leg irons and chainmail bit by bit. Above all, they lived in shifts. One warrior would do the truly difficult watch, building and tending fires through the night, while the others snatched sleep by hot coals. Perhaps the most valuable heat survival tactic was to burn any spare fat. Lords kept pig or beef fat, often using them as lamp fuel. Melted tallow was poured into bowls as emergency light-bright fires. A handful of dried dung or resin could get a reluctant blaze started when wood was scarce. Men in the castles could be found wrestling with peat, cut from bogs, or breaking up briar roots. Every scrap was fair game. Even old armor was cut into stirrups or shaped into fire pouches. Finally, prayer and ritual also counted. Bonfires were lit on feast days. St. John's midsummer bonfire was common, to symbolically burn away the darkness. A living Yule log might be taken from one family to the next, each adding a branch and keeping the embers alive until Christmas supper. Such traditions didn't heat a knight's helm, but they offered hope and a moment of warmth against the long cold. With fire burning and bellies full of hot stew, knights could force winter to retreat a bit, yet whatever logs remained unburned had to carry them through. Food, heat, and clothing all interlocked, but so did spirit. Let's now see what filled those larders and bellies during winter. Feast and famine, winter diets and nutrition. Food was fuel. A knight's body needed calories and warmth, especially when outside all day. The late medieval diet, though heavy, was seasonal. By winter, farmers had slaughtered pigs and cows, cured hams, and filled barrels with salted meat and fish 21. On the knight's table, stews of salted pork or dried venison were common. Fresh meat was a luxury. Even a lord's kitchen might only serve it twice on the worst days of winter, but nobles did not starve. Vegetables survived by chemistry. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, and cabbage were grown in autumn in special fat beds to feed knights in winter. These root veggies kept well in cool cellars under straw. A common peasant soup, pottage, was simply vegetables and barley boiled to mush, sometimes enriched with small pieces of smoked bacon. Onions and leeks were especially prized. Not only did they last in cold storage, but fried or souped, their pungency felt warming. Garlic was rubbed on frost-bitten lips, a good antiseptic. And in camp, some knights believed that eating raw onion or ginger would promote warmth by speeding the blood. Modern herbalists note that medieval remedies for colds often included marjoram, mustard, or ginger to drive out cold humors. Wine spiced with cinnamon was drunk by knights not just for pleasure, but because a hot spiced wine was thought to heat the inwards, much like hot toddies today. Fish and preserved food were vital. In the north, cod and herring were at the core of the cold weather diet. A knight's cook would soak a barrel of brined herring overnight and fry it with onions, a meal rich in protein and salt to sustain morale. Salt itself was guarded treasure. Every kitchen had a leach vessel of salt for brining and pickling. In fact, medieval sources note that salting was the primary means of preserving meat or fish. Coats of salt drawn into pork, or layers of brine in barrels kept food edible for months, even years. Vegetables, too, were pickled in vinegar or in their own brine. Bread and grains formed the base. Knights and squires subsisted on loaves of rye or wheat bread, coarse unleavened bread or daily sourdough loaves. Oats and barley were boiled into thick porridges or gruels, mixed with egg or honey if available, to make a hot meal. One officer might make a dawn lit larks, bread and broth, often called water biscuits in old texts, to eat before morning reveille. Ale and beer were considered food. The yeast-rich brew provided calories and vitamin B, so knights drank ale or weak beer at meals and carried skins of beer on marches as both beverage and fuel. Bulky winter fare meant the stomach and liver were busier than the sword arm. These supplies had to be gathered before freeze-up. A knight in winter might visit nearby villages to requisition pay or provisions. Sometimes a castle's granaries issued bread cards to the poor. Record keepers show that a well-prepared manor set aside uncut butter with high salt so it wouldn't spoil. Flour was stockpiled from harvest. Cheese wheels and salted butter kept well under cold floors. Livestock was a safety net. Sheep were sheared and fed hay. Cows were barn-kept. Their milk churned and churned. Yes, winter meant cream, butter, cheese. A bit of vinegar and honey turned vegetables into pickles or preserves. By late November, a good knight's table had drawers of turnips and onions, racks of jerky, barrels of porridge grains, bottles of honeyed ale, and even dried fruit, apples and prunes, to ward off scurvy. In short, knights ate to live. Lots of protein, fats, and whatever greens were available. One 15th century noble household still served over a kilogram of meat per winter meal and a quarter gallon of beer or wine per person. This hearty diet countered the cold. After all, meat made them strong, and hot broth made them warm. As one cook of the era advised, a man needs at least 3 spoons of soup to keep the humors from turning cold. With bellies filled and fires roaring, a knight's body might be warmed. Yet surviving winter was as much about mind as muscle. In the next section, we'll explore the steel in their spines, the courage, leadership, and faith that kept them going when frostbitten and weary. Iron will, morale, leadership, and faith. Winter's long nights were a test of spirit. An entire army could slump into demoralization if rains turned roads to rivers, or if frost seemed unbreakable. A wise commander knew that psychological endurance was as crucial as physical. Good leaders kept their men busy, drilling routine in camp, sharpening blades, or even staging small nightly guard challenges, rather than letting them sit idle and brood. Feasts at Christmas and Candlemas became moments of relief and unity. Even in war, knights observed these church holidays with extra food, drink, singing, and sometimes sharing the wealth with peasants or mercenaries to keep morale up. Stories and songs helped. Minstrels or heralds would recount heroic tales by the fire. Sagas of Alexander on cold Siberian campaigns, of Roland and Charlemagne, or even humorous jests about one-eyed Olaf the Snowspitter. Camaraderie by the hearth generated its own warmth. Knights exchanged gifts of wool socks or embroidered scarves among themselves, pledged oaths of fealty and brotherhood more fervently in shared adversity. In fact, such cold campaigns are thought to have strengthened the chivalric code. Surviving hardship together fostered loyalty. Faith was another bulwark. Many knights believed that divine providence guided them through winter. Monastic traditions, like the singing of Compline, or even midnight mass on the darkest nights, offered hope. Crusader orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, had formal prayers to keep the spirit kindled against cold. Superstitions crept in, too. Seeing stars on a clear, cold night might be taken as a good omen, or the church readings for St. Blaise protection from freezing. Priests and chaplains were kept busy anointing hands and feet, perhaps more for morale than medicine. Rallying, rousing sayings also helped steel courage. Stories say some commanders would light a bonfire on a hilltop and pray aloud, or lead folk dances. Country dances and wassails were common, to ward off despair. Even in the biting wind, knights might shout a motto or rallying cry before guard duty to feel brotherhood. A shared oath of knighthood took on extra meaning. They were sworn to protect each other, to endure calamity and hardship in the service of lord and king. One chronicler noted that after days of cold, a band of knights would doff their helms, and oath only helmets, clasp shoulders, and vow together to face one more dawn. Physically, leadership meant action too. Officers ensured every man had a cloak to share or a place by the brazier. The biggest laugh was usually shared with the smallest man, keeping spirits high. Some knights kept a stash of herbs, ginger, pepper, mustard, to make spicy broth, humorously called dragon stew, because they truly believed in Galen's saying, "To fight cold, eat hot." All these intangibles, faith, camaraderie, wit, were invisible armor. A knight with frostbitten feet could still stand tall if his comrades bore one arm, if his chaplain sang psalms, or if the Lord's toast hammered home their cause. Next, we turn to another kind of battle. Facing cold's injuries head-on with medieval medicine and myth. Medieval medicine and myths in winter. The chill of winter brought with it dangers no sword could fix: frostbite, pneumonia, and the common cold. Medieval medicine had few answers. Knights often treated injuries by traditional means, applying warm oils, or salves, like rosemary-infused oil, to ache, or binding wounds with poultices. Bloodletting was advised for heat disorders, so in winter perhaps they bled less. But for cold injuries, treatments were a hodgepodge of folk wisdom and Galenic theory. One medieval remedy for chills was to force circulation. For example, an old text, Gerard's Herbal, suggests marjoram as a cure for cold diseases of the brain and head. 23. Knights would sniff crushed marjoram leaves or chew them to draw out blockage in the head. In practice, a knight might jump up and down or march in place if too weak to walk. Drink-wise, mulled wine, or even hot ale with honey and mustard, was a common prescription. The belief was simple: fire was the opposite of cold, so heat cures cold. Soldiers sometimes warmed their feet in their armpits and were instructed never to scrape ice off bare skin. It only worsened the burn. Myths and do's, don'ts flew around camp. A widely told warning was that chilling the head would doom the body, so knights always covered their heads before armor and often kept on their helmets even inside a stable. Many avoided sweating. One erroneous but popular belief was that overheating by exertion would cause a sudden chill. Ironically, standing still in blizzard was often deadlier than trudging to keep warm. Others adhered to charms, carrying garlic clove for good circulation, or putting a handful of pepper under the tongue to draw heat inward. There were also quite a few laughable myths. For example, some believed rubbing frostbitten parts with snow then salt alternately could heal them, a treatment guaranteed to hurt more than help. In truth, the knight's medical toolkit was poor. Frostbitten fingers were treated by gradual rewarming, pouring warm water, not by massage as folk sometimes did, which could damage tissue. Hands would be wrapped in cotton or wool and kept around the fire. If gangrene set in, amputation might be the only remedy, not uncommon by summer. Pneumonia or consumption had no cure. A sick man was sequestered near the hearth and prayed over. Herbs were all they had: queenwort, pennyroyal, mustard plasters on chests, and even these mostly comforted rather than cured. The famed medieval motto was contraria contrariis curantur, opposites cure opposites, so a chill led to hot baths or spiced broth. There was also heavy reliance on faith, invoking Saint Bridget against the cold, or blessing the fire before sleep. Not everything was doom and gloom, though. Venereal remedies or jokes aside, knights sometimes brewed alcohol-based concoctions, what we'd call herbal liqueurs, believed to ward off disease. One recipe from the era called for roasting juniper berries and mixing them with honey to make a sweet-smelling tea good for cold stomachs. Garlic and onions were crushed into decoctions to fend off infection. Charred bread applied as poultice to frost sores. Medieval blood garlanders or wound balms were gargled to stop bleeding if knightly noses or skin bled from cracking cold. None of these treatments come with modern citations, but records and herbals hint at them. Suffice it to say, cold weather medicine was more superstition than science. Knights guarded their warmth as best they could and crossed fingers for divine help. Next, we'll see what happened when winter itself became the stage for warfare. Winter war, campaigns and battles on ice. Typically, winter meant war breaks. Armies usually made winter quarters, disbanding until spring crops and roads returned. Castles and fortified towns offered protection, and most knights hunkered down through the cold months. However, there were daring exceptions. Some leaders deliberately used winter to their advantage. In regions like Northern Europe, winter roads actually made surprise attacks possible. The Teutonic Knights, crusading knights of the Baltic, became famous for winter campaigns. Historian accounts note that the many lakes, rivers, and streams of the Baltic region freeze solid in winter, turning the landscape into flat highways that facilitate travel. Biaka, Valriarmi, 26. And indeed, in February 1336, the Teutonic Order marched a massive army over ice-packed roads into Lithuania. 27. There was little caution of disease or supply. They moved with the ice, not against it. In that campaign, when villagers saw the armored horses crossing frozen Lake Dusha, they panicked. The siege of Pilinai Castle followed, teaching the defenders that winter gave no quarter. In Western Europe, winter wars were rarer, but not unheard of. An English prince might insist on keeping pressure in a peace negotiation, so his army pulled on thick cloaks and camped in the snow. At sea, Scandinavian navies launched raids across the North Sea, even when fraught with ice. Storytellers recall a battle on a frozen lake, often misdated to Saxony in 936. Though historically dubious, it reflects the real tactic. Fighting on solid ice could cut both ways. When mounted knights charged across ice fields, any misstep could flip a warhorse into the freezing water, ending a knight's glory with a fatal dunk. More common was the use of winter siege. Instead of open battle, leaders used ice and cold as tools of siege warfare. One method was to block supplies. If an enemy held a fortress, a winter siege starved them out. The besiegers burned fields, slaughtered remaining livestock outside the walls, and let the cold kill morale. Water supplies might freeze. Knights would say a moat bit back. There were mentions, though scarce records, of hot oil thrown on ice to break it, or of hammers raised over frozen rams. Winter in siege was also psychological. Imagine watching the defenders drag snow and corpses out while the attacking towers still stand. Victories in winter had an aura. They suggested heroic endurance. Chronicles of the Teutonic Order brag of knights walking to battle through blizzards and sleet to reach pagan lands, a feat that became part fact, part legend. In 1242, the famous Battle on the Ice, Lake Peipus, was said to have frozen the Knights of the Livonian Order into a deadly mix with Russian cavalry. That battle likely happened in spring, but its memory fused with winter imagery. Yet, often winter was simply an unwitting foe. A campaign could bog down when unexpected snow closed mountain passes or frost bit hearts with despair. The loss of a battle could be blamed as much on the cold as on the enemy. Many knightly memoirs lament the winter took our stronghold, meaning sickness and hunger did. Even the most disciplined force had to sometimes yield to winter's siege mentality. What kept the knights fighting through these horrors? Loyalty and solidarity. In the final part, we turn from strategies to the bonds that warmed knights more than any fur. Brotherhood of the cold, loyalty and camaraderie. In the crucible of winter, brotherhood meant survival. Knights, men sworn to protect each other, relied on that oath when frost seemed invincible. Imagine a line of knights, muddy and shivering, shoulders touching around a feeble fire under a tent tarp. A spare cloak might be shared. One soldier's armor acted as a wall against another's back wind. Stories tell of knights taking watch with extra eyes open, each determined to catch a weasel stirring through the camp in case he sought warmth in blankets. Loyalty was not just poetic. One chronicler notes that when supplies failed, knights often stuck together to pool rations. If any one man's stomach pinch, we all taste hunger together, one knight reportedly declared, having his meat ration. They carried on, sharing what precious bits remained. If one fell ill, a brother knelt by him, pressing warm, ale-soaked cloths to his brow or holding him upright by firelight. Comradeship was also belief in the mission. Knights bound by fealty to a lord or a cause would grit their teeth and bear to the end. Around a campfire, legends of ancestors braving winters past were retold. St. Paul of Thebes, St. Nicholas in a storm, or tales of Vikings who sang for warmth. Laughter still rose despite hollowed cheeks. A barbaric joke could echo among clinking mugs. Strategic loyalty helped too. Officer knights led by example. One might do a morning charge around camp with his horse to stir blood. A captain might declare that the man who lifts his broadsword and shouts a prayer for warmth gains a cup of spiced wine. These incentives, humble as they seem, pulled a smile or a guffaw out of frost-bitten lips. Religious camaraderie also sprang up. Many knights, especially Templars or Hospitallers, prayed in common. On extra cold nights, a makeshift chapel in a tent held vigil candles. They felt warmed, at least emotionally, by the knowledge that even Christ endured human sufferings. Calendars noted that Christ's baptism and epiphany happened amid winter cold. Songs of faith were sung softly after meals, giving each man hope that God would grant them spring. Children of the cold, these nights found warmth in kinship. The medieval saying, "one cloak for two," implying we must share even scarce shelter, was more lived than heard. On victory or retreat, they managed to keep their fellowship intact. And that fellowship, that collective heartbeat, would be their shield even against winter-turned weapon. Winter as a weapon. Strategy in ice and snow. To some crafty generals, winter itself was another weapon to wield. In deep winter, even in medieval times, men practiced small sabotage, breaking ice beneath enemy walls to flood camps, or burning wood so fast that the ash blew into enemy eyes. One medieval Balkan source tells of defenders greasing church bells and swinging them wildly in freezing wind as a superstitious attempt to drive off winter. Symbolic, but it shows the desperation. In siege defense, knights sometimes built traps for cold. They'd hurl boiling oil or sand onto attackers trudging in snow, making the frozen ground slick. Rain and snow could be channeled via ditches to freeze around encampments, sealing a camp inside an ice moat if time allowed. Carts of cow dung might be burned in front of gates. The steaming smoke both blinded attackers and melted snow underfoot to slow cavalry. These crude methods took advantage of winter's natural lethargy to hinder a foe. King Alfred of England, 9th century, famously ordered his men to scatter ashes around their camp at night so they could see the tracks of any Norseman trying to sneak in the dark. Though slightly anachronistic, such tactics appear in medieval stories. The idea that winter darkness was a cloak, but the snow could betray footsteps. So a knight captain might literally throw down a ring of embers or dunk a torch in snow to create illuminated perimeter. There's also the cruel side of cold as weapon, when one side simply withdrew, forcing the enemy to starve in winter quarters. Some commanders retreated into winter, knowing pursuit was suicidal. The Mongols, later than medieval Europe, essentially used this by vanishing at winter's approach. In Europe, lords of castles often spread rumors of winter pestilence coming to trick invaders into lifting sieges. Half-truth, scurvy and illness did stalk winter camps if fresh food ran out. On the battlefield itself, a surprise snowstorm was a nightmare for unprepared horses. Some knights in lore let their banners ride high, shock of color, to keep morale when everything else looked white. Others tied bits of animal fur to their lances to warn comrades if freezing rain or fog rolled in, like a primitive weather vane. Even the choice of time mattered. Delaying battle until sunset, when temperatures drop, could be a stall tactic. Of course, weather could mislead. A believed omen of sunrise after a freezing night gave knights confidence. They'd light signal fires on hills at dawn to boost the entire army's spirit. Strangely, soldiers of fortune even built snowmen or effigies in camp, taunting winter as a way of defying fear. They joked, "We'll be damned if frost fools us." Ultimately, though, winter's true weapon was exhaustion. Many medieval historians argue that more soldiers succumbed to cold and hunger than to sword. To the knights, the cold was a constant enemy whose wounds were invisible. They fought it with every fabric, fire, morsel, and thought they had. Epilogue. Endurance beyond metal. By spring, the snow thawed, and the survivors of winter looked remarkably human despite their steel. The medieval knight in winter was a far cry from the unblemished hero of legend. He was layered in wool, with a soot-streaked face and a limp from frostbite. Yet he stood firm. Across Europe, these men, driven by honor, faith, loyalty, or sheer stubbornness, proved something timeless. Humanity can forge resilience even under the direst conditions. When we recall knights, it's easy to remember jousts and tournaments. But perhaps the greatest feats of those warriors were off the training field, huddled around a dying fire at midnight, helping a comrade with bandaged fingers, or slogging through knee-deep snow to keep a promise. They never had thermal underwear, but they did have each other. They lacked heaters, but heated soup and laughter did wonders. In breaking castle's cold silence, the warmth of camaraderie, duty, and hope persevered. So while history often glosses over these small struggles, they are in many ways the truest test of knighthood. We may forget the names of individual knights, but the fact that they endured tells us about human strength. It reminds us that courage isn't only in bold charges, but in surviving the quiet, soul-searing cold of a medieval night. In that sense, every surviving tale of a winter past is a small legend of courage, one that speaks to the forgotten endurance of the past. Please make sure to subscribe and watch our other video as well. The Middle Ages is often painted in the mind by sweeping images of heroes and castles, of gallant knights charging into battle and kings feasting in great halls. But for most people who actually lived in that era, life was anything but heroic or idyllic. Instead of this romanticized picture, we must face the brutal reality. Daily existence was dangerous, filthy, and short. In this video, we'll peel back the tapestry of legend to show why a modern person simply would not last a day in the Middle Ages. Imagine waking at dawn inside a wooden shack shared with livestock. Your bed is just a pile of straw, and winter's breath seeps through cracks in the walls. There are no stoves or electric lights, only the flicker of a smoky hearth in a dark corner. Today, you might consult a weather app. In medieval times, you prayed for sunshine and risked freezing in the cold. Every sunrise was a test. Children shivered with hunger and disease. Women endured childbirth without anesthesia, and even a small cut could become lethal. Forget glamorous costumes and epic tales. For common folk, the Middle Ages was a long ordeal. If your daily schedule seems busy today, imagine a time when even the simplest tasks were life or death matters. Rain meant flooded fields, not just a canceled picnic. A broken light bulb now is an inconvenience. A failing hearth fire in a blizzard then could mean freezing to death. Our modern comforts set the stage. We have never known what life was like without them. Daily life offered no safety net. There were no hospitals, no running water, and no safety regulations. Travelers didn't stop at inns or fast food restaurants. They often slept in barns or fields. There were no 911 calls or quick medical fixes. Even getting lost was perilous. Wandering into the forest could mean never coming home. Entertainment was sparse. A church sermon, a village fair, or a brawl in a tavern, not a movie or video game. By the end of this video, you'll understand that stepping into that world, even for a day, would test every ounce of modern resilience. We might joke about getting lost in time, but for medieval people, small comforts were unimaginable. There were no roadside diners. A basic meal took hours to prepare or miles of travel to obtain. Rolling blackouts in our time? Medieval farmers had no mills powered by anything but animal muscle. This video will be an eye-opener. The Middle Ages were no escapist adventure, but a harsh reality that few today could survive. Get ready for a stark journey through the most unforgiving era in human history. Medieval Europe spanned roughly a millennium, from the fall of Rome around 500 AD to the early 1500s. During that era, the continent was a patchwork of feuding kingdoms, duchies, and empires. After Rome's collapse, new borders formed constantly as local warlords fought for land. By the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300, larger kingdoms like England, France, and Spain had emerged, but these were still coalitions of barons and nobles rather than unified nations. Even if you tried to rebel, the system was against you. Peasants were bound to their lord's land. They could not leave the village, marry, or change jobs without permission. In exchange for meager protection, they surrendered almost everything they owned. A large portion of the harvest went to the Lord and a tithe to the church, plus unpaid labor days on the Lord's fields. If the Lord went to war, peasants could be conscripted. Every aspect of life was controlled by the manor. In short, peasants had virtually no freedom or rights. Daily life was filthy and dangerous. Most families lived in one-room huts made of mud or straw, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. A single hearth fire provided light and heat, and it filled the hut with smoke. Homes were cold, damp, and swarming with lice, fleas, and mice. Villages had no sanitation. Waste was tossed into the yard or street, attracting flies and a constant stench. Narrow dirt lanes turned to quagmires in the rain, and bandits roamed these muddy roads. Castles and churches loomed overhead, but they offered no protection for poor peasants. They were places of power, not sanctuaries for the common folk. Without sanitation and clean water, disease spread easily. People drank from wells or streams, often contaminated. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid swept through towns frequently. Remember the Black Death of 1348? That was medieval Europe at its worst, and we'll examine it next. Survivors of epidemics noted that life expectancy was tragically low, perhaps 30 to 35 years at best. Infant mortality was high. Many children never saw their 6th birthday. People died so frequently that burials sometimes became mass graves in village fields. Technology and comfort as we know them did not exist. There was no electricity, central heating, or plumbing. Winters were pitch black and bitterly cold without light. Food spoiled quickly. Only salting, smoking, or drying preserved anything. Most meals were coarse rye bread and watery porridge. Spices, sugar, and fresh fruit were rare luxuries enjoyed only by nobles. Clean water was often scarce, so waterborne diseases were common. Even towns offered little relief. Medieval cities were crowded labyrinths of wooden buildings leaning precariously. There was no sewage system. Waste and animal manure clogged the streets. Wealthier cities built stone walls for defense, but those walls did nothing for hygiene. Merchants might hire guards for protection, but villagers had no law enforcement at all. If you broke a leg in the fields, the nearest doctor was days away by horse, if one existed at all. Many everyday conveniences had not yet been invented. There were no clocks. Time was marked by church bells or the sun. There were no cheap books or newspapers. Almost everyone was illiterate. Education and knowledge were locked in Latin, far from the plow and hut. Even simple machines were rare. Mills to grind grain by water or wind were communal, but anything beyond hand mills was scarce. No eyeglasses, no paved roads, no standardized medicine. People built with muscle and wood, never imagining what a modern builder could do with steel and steam. The church dominated life. Villagers rose and rested by the sound of the Angelus bells. Every child was baptized, every marriage blessed, every death sent off by clergy. Tithes and offerings went to fund the priests and bishops who recorded every legal transaction. So the church kept track of births, marriages, and deaths. The church also taught obedience to God, and thus to earthly lords. Every sermon reinforced that one's station in life was ordained, no matter how poor you were. Early medieval times, 500 to 800 AD, were filled with migrations and instability. After Rome fell, tribes like the Visigoths, Lombards, and Franks carved out new kingdoms. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 AD, briefly reunited much of Western Europe, bringing roads in order, but his empire split soon after his death. The High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300 AD, saw the rise of knights and castles and the church at its peak power. The Crusades to the Holy Land, 1095 to 1291, consumed much of the nobility. Even peasants could be affected. Some were pressed into support roles or had to pay taxes to fund these wars. In England and France, kings began consolidating power, e.g., Magna Carta in 1215 limited the king's tax-raising ability. But ordinary peasants saw none of these benefits, only additional levies. The late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500 AD, brought disaster. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, due to relentless rains and crop failures, before the plague. Then, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, 1347 to 1350, killed roughly half of Europe. War after war followed. The 100 Years' War between England and France from 1337 to 1453, conflicts with the Ottoman Turks, etc., extracting more blood and taxes from the populace. Each turn of the century still looked grim to a peasant. Taxes, sieges, and rumors of the next epidemic. We should mention some laws. After the Black Death, labor was scarce, so peasants had more bargaining power, but feudal lords often enacted laws to freeze wages and bind workers, like England's Statute of Laborers in 1351. In practice, that meant that even after so much death, peasants still had to work for the same low wages. Rebellions flared briefly, like the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 England, but they were crushed, and the overall system remained feudal. In summary, medieval society offered almost no mercy. Power and wealth were held by a tiny minority, while everyone else lived in constant peril of hunger, disease, and violence. Lords feasted on meat and wine in grand halls, while peasants ate gruel. A small fever could be a death sentence. There were no safety nets, no hospitals, no crop insurance, no police. Survival was never guaranteed. With this grim backdrop in mind, we turn to the deadliest aspect of that age: the plagues and illnesses that stalked every village and field. The Black Death was the most infamous killer of the Middle Ages, a pandemic that left virtually no village untouched. Arriving in Europe around 1347, it swept across the continent in a matter of years. Entire towns were emptied. It's estimated that at least half of Europe's population perished in just a few years. The disease struck without warning. A villager might feel fine in the morning and be dead by night with horrendous buboes, swollen, blackened lymph nodes, and a raging fever. Plague was spread by fleas carried on rats, and medieval Europe teemed with rodents. Granaries, refuse piles, and thatched huts were ideal rat homes. Infected fleas hopped from these rats onto humans, introducing deadly bacteria into the bloodstream. People, not knowing about germs, blamed bad air or divine punishment. In reality, any rat harboring infected fleas could spark a deadly outbreak. Smallpox, measles, and influenza also raged through towns, leaving survivors scarred and often blind. Cholera caused lethal dehydration, dysentery turned stomachs to poison, and typhus, spread by lice, decimated crowded army camps. Every cut or scrape was dangerous. Even a small wound could fester into gangrene. Infants and children suffered terribly. Many families lost one or two children every few years. Women faced grave danger in childbirth, with no antiseptics or anesthesia. Puerperal fever, postpartum infection, was common and deadly. Medicine was primitive and mostly ineffective. Medieval doctors followed the theory of 4 humors. When you were sick, a barber surgeon might bleed you to balance humors, draining perhaps several ounces of blood into a bowl. They also applied herbal poultices or leeches. Of course, this often only weakened patients further. For example, a doctor might use leeches on a feverish patient, hoping to draw off illness, but without any understanding of infection, this could cause fatal blood loss. Herbal remedies and folk cures were common, but unreliable. People burned herbs like sage, juniper, and rosemary to fumigate their homes, thinking smoke would ward off sickness. Some carried posies of flowers to sniff, giving rise to the phrase, "pushing up daisies." Others drank concoctions of vinegar and spices. The wealthiest even swallowed bits of crushed emerald or oysters. Medieval doctors believed precious stones had healing properties. None of these prevented the plague's death. Hospitals as we know them were virtually non-existent. In cities, pest houses or quarantine huts were set up outside the walls, ramshackle places where the sick were dumped to die. Families were often forbidden from visiting. Clergy sometimes refused to enter, fearing contagion. Bodies were piled into mass graves dug in fields or churchyards. Crowds of corpses made the air thick with stench. Some monks chanted prayers day and night, but prayers couldn't stop the scourge. Even the church suffered losses. In some parishes, 3 out of 4 priests died in a single outbreak. New clergy had to be hastily ordained from rural areas, leaving those villages short-staffed. People wondered why God allowed so much death. Some saw miracles when survivors recovered. Others saw portents and omens in comets or eclipses. Remember, comets often coincided with outbreaks and were called harbingers of doom. Other diseases thrived alongside plague. Smallpox and measles were endemic. Children fell ill seasonally, often leaving scars or blindness. Malaria, the marsh fever, afflicted swampy regions each summer, causing recurring bouts of chills. Tuberculosis hollowed out lungs slowly over years. In winter garrisons, lice-borne typhus ran rampant. In each village, people lived with a buffet of bacteria and viruses. Hygiene was nearly non-existent. Peasants bathed rarely, often just once a year, if at all. A good wife might wash by the river on a Sunday. Skin infections, ringworm, scabies, and lice were common. Tooth decay was universal. Many adults had few teeth by age 30. A tooth abscess could spread to the brain and kill. Parasitic worms wriggled through intestines, causing pain and anemia. You might, for example, never see the worms that lived in your dog, but they could jump to you. A medieval peasant also lived with constant fevers and chills. Even simple respiratory infections often led to pneumonia without antibiotics. Croup or whooping cough could strangle an infant. Without cough medicine or even soothing teas, sick adults were bedridden. They might gargle vinegar for sore throats or wrap fevers in wet sheets, reducing fever but often causing shock. It was an endless game of chance. Each cough in a neighbor could mean funerals next week. Clean water was a luxury. Rivers and wells were open to all, animals and people. Cholera and dysentery outbreaks caused by fecal bacteria could wipe out whole families in days. Typhoid took months to kill slowly. Villagers tried crude filters, cloth over a bucket, or herbal remedies, but without boiling water, which they rarely did, their defenses were weak. Wealth did not provide immunity. Nobles lived in cleaner castles, but disease could still infiltrate. If your lord contracted plague, you had no idea. Heraldry or locks on doors meant little to a contagion. Lords sometimes fled to the country when epidemics hit cities, but most peasants had no escape. If your entire village fell ill, there was no army doctor or crusading knight to save you. You were on your own with ash, vinegar, and prayer. To illustrate the horror, medieval chroniclers often wrote that the dead lay in the streets like refuse. One 14th century account describes a traveler arriving to find only corpses. Hungry wolves were the only creatures left. It sounds unbelievable, but not to them. It was normal to hear of villages so depopulated that cows were eating people's straw beds. By any measure, medieval disease was unstoppable by their standards. Without germ theory or sanitation, sickness was life's constant shadow. Each morning, a peasant took up his tools, wondering which fatal disease the day would bring. Comparing to today, it is like living under constant pandemic alert with none of the science or support we have. No wonder a modern person dropped into a 14th century village would feel death around every corner. Medieval peasants rarely enjoyed scenes like this. The image above depicts a peasant wedding, one of the few times villagers would gather for dancing and celebration. Notice the simplicity: wooden benches, a steaming pot of stew, and straw on the floor. Such festivities were rare. For every night of music and dance, peasants spent countless dawn-to-dusk days plowing fields or tending livestock. Even preparing for a wedding feast meant months of extra work. Brewing beer, baking bread, and killing a pig if they could afford it. Above the village loomed the lord's castle, a constant reminder of who held power. This fortress on the hill, like the one above, symbolizes the wall of privilege separating nobles from common folk. Peasants' cottages lay far below. The castle's protection did not extend to them. Instead, its banners reminded them that their labor and taxes filled the lord's coffers, not their own. Every day began before sunrise. The rooster's crow awakened peasant families from their straw beds. Without alarm clocks, work started at first light. Men led cows and sheep out to pasture or yoked oxen to plow fields. Women lit the fire, ground grain by hand, and prepared breakfast of thin gruel or pottage. Children already fetched water from the well or gathered eggs. By dawn, the village was alive with toil. seasonal cycles defined life. In spring, peasants rushed to plow and sow, shoulder to shoulder in the fields. They scattered seed by hand and covered it with earth, praying for rain. Summer meant constant weeding and tending. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly on backs bent in rows. Autumn was brutal. Every cornstalk, bean pod, and turnip had to be harvested before winter. Families worked all day and often into the night to bring in the harvest. If rains came early, everything could spoil and people would starve. Winter offered no respite. Fields lay fallow, but chores continued. Wood was chopped for fire, thatches were mended, and sheep still needed wool sheared before the cold worsened. Chickens had to be fed on foraged scraps. Inside, women spun wool and wove cloth by lamplight. Festivals like Christmas were some of the few breaks, yet even Christmas required cooking and cleaning for days. Sundays were supposed to be rest days, but for peasants they often meant no extra food, only one day without feudal labor. Children worked alongside adults. By age 5 or 6, a child might help carry water or tend a chicken coop. By 8 or 10, boys helped plow or herd. Girls helped churn butter or wash clothes. There was no modern childhood. Everyone's hands were needed. Only when they were strong enough did families feel safe having more children, as infant mortality was high. In some years, couples might lose a newborn or two. Mothers dreaded childbirth and neonatal illnesses. Half of all children might not survive to adulthood in a village. Diet was meager and monotonous. The daily meal was black bread made of rye or barley, and a thin soup of cabbage or beans. Perhaps a few onions or wild greens were added. Meat was rare. Maybe once a year a pig was butchered for special occasions, or game was shared after a lord's hunt. Fat was scarce, so meals were watery and salty. People drank weak ale or cider since water was often unsafe. Every scrap of food was precious. Bread might be dried into suet or turned into porridge the next day. Sweets like honey or fruit were luxuries, not everyday fare. Hunger and malnutrition followed peasants year-round. In bad years, they ate bark, dandelion greens, or even clay from riverbanks to stave off starvation. Scurvy, lack of vitamin C, and rickets, lack of D, were common. Gums bled, bones weakened, though no one understood why. This meant peasant bodies were frail. A man might have to ration meat between family members, or a mother might even give her portion to her children. The lean were a normal sight. Children often went to bed hungry, and adults aged prematurely from constant toil and poor diet. Most peasants lived in simple huts. A typical cottage was 1 or 2 rooms with mud walls or crude stone, thatched roof, and a packed earth floor. A single hearth in the center provided the only heat and light. Furnishings were sparse: a wooden table and benches, a few earthenware bowls, and straw mattresses on the floor. Entire families slept huddled in one bed or on straw mats. Sometimes animals, a pig, goats, or chickens, slept in a corner or next door for warmth. Privacy didn't exist. Neighbors leaned through open doors like windows, and most sounds of family life were heard by all. Parasites and pests infested everyday life. Bedbugs, lice, and fleas were constant companions. A peasant might shrug off being bitten by dozens of insects each night as just another discomfort. Rats and mice scurried through homes devouring scraps. People burned herbs or clanged pots to drive them out, but the vermin always returned. Some smeared walls with clay or ashes to try to repel bugs. Life was one of constant itching and disease risk from these tiny creatures. Clothing was homemade and simple. Most peasants wore wool or coarse linen. Bright colors were rare. Dyes cost more than the cloth. Each person owned only a few outfits. A man typically had a shirt, a wool tunic, trousers, hose, and a cloak. Women had an underdress and a wool overdress. Garments were patched continuously. Since wool and linen were valuable, fabric was reused endlessly. An old cloak might become a vest, then a patch on someone else's doublet. Shoes were precious. People often walked barefoot or wore simple wooden clogs or thin leather shoes when they had them. Going barefoot in winter meant frostbitten toes were common, with no care beyond covering them with rags. Given these conditions, nutrition barely kept them alive. Grain and vegetables provided the few calories they could gather. Without proper diet, peasants were small and weak by modern standards. Still, they rationed every crumb. Brewing was a chore done sparingly. There were no pubs where one could drown sorrows with ale. It was a family staple for calories. Occasionally, a villager might share a jug at a neighbor's house to comfort the end of a hard day. But there was no leisure drinking. Instead, the day ended often in silence, with prayers. Above all, peasants had almost no freedom. If a peasant wanted to marry or move to another manor, he needed the Lord's permission and usually a hefty fee. Leaving a manor without consent was a crime. Each family was tied to the land they farmed, a status called serfdom. Serfs could not simply seek work elsewhere. On a serf's death, the family's obligations to the Lord transferred to the eldest son. In practice, this meant peasants could not improve their station through effort or thrift. The Lord controlled their lives and inheritances. Life was tightly scheduled by obligation. First came the Lord's demand for labor. A peasant owed a set number of days working on the domain, the Lord's fields, each year. Only after the Lord's fields were plowed and harvested could peasants tend their own plots. Then came taxes and fees, the tithe to the church, 1/10 of produce, plus manorial dues. A peasant often paid for every simple act: hunting, baking bread, fishing, brewing, even using the Lord's mill or oven. For example, to grind grain, you had to take your wheat to the Lord's mill and give some flour as rent. To use the communal oven, you might pay a loaf's worth. These high justice rights drained peasants of independence. Because of these burdens, survival itself was an effort. On the occasional feast day when labor was supposed to pause, saints' days, Christmas, people might sing or play rudimentary games in the square. These communal gatherings were precious and few. Otherwise, day after day was a grind, digging, hauling, planting, with no guaranteed reward beyond the next sunrise. The personal toll was enormous. Many peasants died young from causes already discussed: disease, malnutrition, or accident. Women risked death in childbirth or died carrying heavy water buckets each day. Children faced dangerous tasks. Babies were left outdoors during harvest to sleep near working parents, at risk of wild dogs or falling debris. Even animals and weather treated them poorly. A fall from a horse or a cart could break a leg, often followed by gangrene. And a sudden hailstorm could wipe out the year's work in minutes. To never feel a day off is an understatement. Sundays were often spent still chopping wood or tending animals. The only weekend might be one day a year when the Lord granted a break, such as a harvest festival, but even that was spent cooking and preparing food. By any measure, a peasant's life was brutal. Physical exhaustion from labor, constant hunger, and the threat of disease meant that each year felt like a battle. There were no retirement plans, no social security, no escape. Only sheer endurance, faith, and the solidarity of family kept peasants going through each harsh season. Having felt the weight of daily peasant labor and poverty, It's clear that medieval villagers faced unimaginable hardship. Now, we turn to the social and cultural forces that constrained them even further. The church was the lens through which medieval people viewed everything. Every village had a parish church with a priest, who was often the most educated person around. From birth to death, religion marked each step. Babies were baptized immediately, sometimes within days. Marriages were solemnized at the altar, and funerals were church ceremonies. The church preached obedience to God. Thus, obedience to earthly lords was a virtue. Every sermon reinforced that one's lowly social status was ordained by God. This taught peasants to accept their hardships and trust in divine justice, rather than seek change. Religious obligations were heavy. Families paid a tithe of their crops to support the church, 1/10 of everything. They had to attend Mass every Sunday and on holy days. Missing church might result in fines or penance. The priest kept registers of births, weddings, and deaths, giving the church control over social records. Church courts could judge small cases, marital disputes, moral issues, for peasants. Being excommunicated, kicked out of the church, was a terrifying punishment. Without last rites, a person was believed to be damned. Dogma and superstition were entwined. The church taught vivid images of heaven and hell, so people feared dying in sin. Even the plague was described in moral terms. God's punishment for wickedness. Witchcraft and curses had early roots. If a cow died, a neighbor or widow might be suspected of hexing it. Cures often involved holy relics or prayers. For example, a person might carry a thorn from Christ's crown or a piece of a saint's bone as protection. Magic charms and folk rituals, like burying a horseshoe for luck, coexisted with church beliefs. Essentially, superstition filled every gap in knowledge. Entertainment and cultural life were limited. The church calendar provided the only festivals: Christmas, Easter, and saints' days. On these days, peasants ate better food, wore their good clothes, and the village might hold a dance or fair. Mystery plays, dramatic biblical stories, were sometimes staged on feast days, giving a brief taste of theater. For everyday fun, peasants told stories by the hearth or hummed work songs in the fields. Village fairs, annual markets, offered trading and occasional jesters or musicians, but there were no theaters or books for pleasure. Leisure was mostly communal and brief. Women had defined roles and few rights. A medieval woman was expected to obey her father or husband. Daughters usually married by their mid-teens to form alliances or gain security. Romantic love was a luxury beyond most. Once married, a peasant woman worked alongside her husband plowing or harvesting, then came home to grind grain, cook, churn butter, weave cloth, and care for children. They also fetched water, tended the fire, and cared for the sick. It was a life of relentless labor. They were generally illiterate. Only nuns or noblewomen might read Latin prayer books. Women could not own land. All wealth was in the Lord's hands. If a widow had no sons, her late husband's brothers or lord usually took charge of property and debts. Some noble or freeborn women became abbesses, but peasant women had no path to power. Childhood was short and grim. Children were baptized quickly, then educated at home. Boys learned the father's trade, cobbling, woodcutting, farming, while girls learned the mother's tasks. There were no schools for peasant children. If you could read at all, it was because you served a lord or joined a monastery. Children played simple games, but these were rare. They might play ring around the rosy or kick a rag ball. Toys were homemade: cloth dolls, wooden blocks, hoops. Most of their time was spent running errands or helping in the fields. Death hovered over them. Losing a sibling was common. Orphans often became farmhands for relatives or ended up in child labor. They grew up fast, with little chance to simply be children. Socially, identity was fixed. A person born a peasant died a peasant. There was virtually no social mobility. Village life taught this at every turn. Legends and fables praised humble virtue and obedience, never rebellion. Even bedtime stories echoed obedience to God and king. Authority was enforced by fear. Stealing, poaching on the Lord's land, or defying attacks could lead to whipping, mutilation, or execution. Peasants had no lawyers. Justice was harsh and immediate. For example, cutting down a tree on the Lord's land could mean losing a hand. Community ties were vital for survival. Villagers worked together for harvests, built each other's houses, and shared tools. Church teachings also encouraged charity. Monks might distribute bread to the poor on feast days. Neighbors shared what little they had during famines. These acts of mutual aid were a bright spot in an otherwise bleak life. But even these communal bonds came with obligations. If you helped a neighbor plow, he owed the same help in return. Failure to show up meant reprimands from the reeve, village official. In this era, culture offered no escape from hardship. Every story and sermon reinforced the status quo. People believed they were born into this life for a reason. When disaster struck, they blamed fate or sin, not the system. Only the rare rebel or wanderer questioned their lot. For the most part, peasants accepted their hard lives as God's will. In summary, medieval culture and religion added another layer of hardship. The church demanded loyalty and tithes, but gave no tangible help. Cultural norms enforced obedience and hard work. Women and children had no voice. Entertainment was one day, off a week at best. Combined with the disease and toil we've already seen, it's obvious that a medieval peasant had virtually no safety or comfort by modern standards. Having seen how ruthless daily work, disease, and social rules were, a modern person would have found that medieval life afforded almost no respite. In every aspect, work, home, belief, and family, the world was stacked against them. After this journey, the Middle Ages no longer seem like a fairy tale backdrop. Instead, they emerge as a gauntlet, an age that tested every human capacity from body to spirit. We've faced down plagues that killed half of Europe, witnessed the endless days of back-breaking labor just to eke out a meal, and felt the weight of laws and dogma that left people powerless. We saw that every breath and every heartbeat in medieval times was a victory over overwhelming odds. For a modern person, remembering what we have is crucial. Think of the smallest conveniences: running water in our homes, a doctor a phone call away, warm showers on cold nights. These are modern miracles that medieval people never imagined. A heating system, refrigeration, or a simple hygienic toilet would be like magic to them. Jet planes and the internet? Beyond their wildest dreams. Conversely, our biggest daily problems, a power outage, a slow internet connection, would seem utterly trivial to someone living back then. Whenever we gripe about a minor inconvenience, remember that medieval peasants faced catastrophes daily. A failed roof tile, a spoiled crop, or a sprained ankle could be a death sentence. When you enjoy a doctor's care for a headache, remember that any infection could kill your ancestors. Each warm meal we eat, every safe night's sleep, every vaccination, these are gifts that our medieval forebears could only dream of. Understanding these hardships also gives perspective on progress. It reminds us how revolutionary modern advances are. Antibiotics turned once deadly infections into treatable ailments. Refrigeration wiped out so many foodborne illnesses. Sanitation systems made cholera and typhoid diseases of the past. Even simple pleasures, like reading a book by lamplight without fear, stem from centuries of invention. The plow, the wheel, the printing press, germ theory. Each step forward came at the price of enduring precisely the sorts of horrors we've discussed. We owe those lives to the progress we have today. There is also a sobering lesson for our world today. Our ancestors endured things that are hard to even fathom. They built the structures, farms, hospitals, laws, that eventually led to our modern knowledge. But in their time, people coped with suffering by faith and community. There is a dark echo in parts of the world where people still live with scant resources and little infrastructure. This history teaches empathy for them. Many people today still face daily struggles for food, clean water, or medical care. If there is one clear takeaway, it is this: medieval life was grueling and unforgiving on all fronts, physically, mentally, and socially. In those times, each day was a survival test, and each moment was taken on faith. If you find parts of that hard to believe, ask yourself, how quickly would you adapt to that world? Thank you for watching. If this deep dive gave you a new perspective or gratitude, let me know in the comments below. Share your thoughts. What modern convenience do you think would shock a medieval peasant the most? A warm bath? A smartphone? It's fascinating to compare our world to theirs. Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, mistress of reform and icon of ambition, she was simply Sophie born. Sophie Federica Augusta von Anhalterst in 1729. She was the daughter of a relatively obscure German princely family. Her tiny duchy in Pomerania offered little in terms of power, but Sophie herself, she had something no title could provide: razor-sharp intelligence, relentless charm, and a quiet, burning hunger for greatness. Her upbringing was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and calculating, not a warm, nurturing figure, but a social climber obsessed with status. Sophie's father, a Prussian officer, was more distant than disciplinary. From a young age, Sophie learned to walk the fine line between obedience and cunning. She read voraciously, spoke multiple languages, and learned how to observe a room before speaking in it. Skills that would soon become survival tools in one of Europe's most brutal courts. When the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrona began searching for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked beyond Russia's borders. Peter himself was of German descent, and Empress Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, pliable and grateful, would be easier to control. Sophie fit the bill perfectly. Noble blood, Lutheran faith which she'd be forced to abandon, and a reputation for both grace and humility. At just 14 years old, Sophie was summoned to Russia. She arrived in the freezing capital of St. Petersburg in 1744, wearing thin German fabrics and a diplomatic smile. Her mother pushed her forward like a chess piece. Sophie, however, had her own game in mind. To become acceptable in Russian society, she converted to Orthodoxy, taking the name Ekaterina Alexa Catherine. The ceremony was public, symbolic, and life-altering. She wasn't just changing religions. She was burning the bridge behind her, stepping into a foreign empire with no way back. No one watching that quiet teenage girl in a fur-trimmed coat could have predicted what would come next. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. But from the moment Sophie stepped foot in the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn and began planning how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke. Peter was meant to secure her place in Russian royalty, but from the very beginning, it felt more like a cage than a crown. Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was not the dashing prince of fairy tales. Awkward, immature, and obsessed with toy soldiers, he was far more interested in playing war games in his chambers than governing an empire or showing affection to his new wife. Some accounts even suggest he refused to consummate the marriage for years. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia and resented the Russian court that had adopted him. In contrast, Catherine embraced Russia with a fierce determination. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox rituals. She wanted to belong. Peter wanted to escape. This mismatch wasn't just emotional, it was political. The Russian court was a viper's nest of gossip, paranoia, and brutal power games. Empress Elizabeth still ruled with absolute authority, but her health was in decline. Everyone knew a transition was coming, and everyone had an agenda. Catherine was watched constantly. Her letters were read, her friendships monitored, and her every move scrutinized. She couldn't trust her husband, her mother who was still whispering in her ear on behalf of foreign interests, or even her servants. In this world, alliances could turn into accusations overnight, but Catherine was no fool. She learned to play the court's games quietly, cultivating allies in the shadows. She charmed military officers, made friends with scholars, and developed a reputation for dignity and restraint, a stark contrast to her husband's childish tantrums and open contempt for Russian traditions. Behind closed doors, Catherine began reading Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. While others saw her as a young consort, she was building a vision, not just for herself, but for Russia, a nation of strength, education, and reason. But there was one problem. The longer Peter lived, the longer Catherine remained in limbo, a powerless wife to a man unfit to rule. So she waited, observed, and planned. She knew the Russian throne wouldn't be inherited. It would have to be taken in 1762, after nearly 2 decades of waiting, watching, and quietly maneuvering. Catherine saw her moment and seized it with breathtaking precision. Empress Elizabeth had died, and Peter III, was finally Tsar. But his reign began unraveling almost immediately. In just a few short months, Peter alienated the church, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and lavished praise on Prussia, Russia's longtime enemy. He reversed key policies, humiliated the clergy, and talked openly about divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior, turned cold. The army, filled with generals loyal to Catherine, grumbled in corridors. Even ordinary Russians, devout and patriotic, saw Peter as a foreign puppet. Who mocked their traditions. Catherine, watching all of this unfold, made her move. In July of that same year, while Peter was away at his summer palace, Catherine launched a bloodless coup d'etat, supported by key military officers, including her lover Gregory Olaf and his influential brothers. She rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, was proclaimed Empress Catherine II, and won the allegiance of the powerful imperial guard. Peter, caught off guard and without allies, surrendered. Within days, he was taken into custody and shortly after found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as a hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, it was murder. Catherine was now empress, not by birth, not by marriage, but by will-wit and audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had taken the Russian throne without a single battle. But her real challenge was just beginning. She had to transform that bold grab for power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without falling victim to the same fate as her husband? Catherine understood that power gained through intrigue could be lost. Just as easily, she needed to rule not as a schemer, but as a visionary. And so began her transformation from a careful conspirator to a reforming empress, one who would redraw borders, embrace the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catherine had the crown, she could have rested on her power, but she didn't. She had something bigger in mind than simply sitting on a throne. She wanted to transform Russia, and not just militarily or politically, but intellectually. While Peter had worshipped Frederick the Great and toy soldiers, Catherine idolized Voltaire, Dado, and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people. Even if she herself ruled with absolute authority, Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy. She lived it. She corresponded directly with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him while defending her autocracy. She invited Dado to her court and even purchased his entire library to support him financially. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts, debated reforms, and crafted policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was filled with efforts to codify Russian law. She formed the Legislative Commission in 1767, an ambitious project intended to rewrite the entire legal code of Russia. Catherine's own nakazes, or instruction, was a political manifesto in disguise, one that spoke of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in 18th century Russia, it was radical. But Enlightenment ideals had to survive the realities of Russia, a vast, feudal, deeply conservative land ruled by nobles who liked their serfs exactly where they were beneath them. Catherine knew this. While she advocated reform, she moved carefully. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, and built schools and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs to keep them loyal. This was Catherine's balancing act. A philosopher queen in a public, a practical empress in private. She walked a tight rope between ideology and survival, between the shining salons of Paris and the gritty politics of the Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. In many ways, Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make Russia modern on her terms. And that meant reform, yes, but with an iron hand and a velvet glove, Catherine wasn't content with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to expand it outward, to make it an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to knock down the walls. Under her leadership, Russia's borders stretched wider than ever before. She waged wars, not just to defend her crown, but to reshape the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves throughout the 1760s and 1770s, weren't just about territory, they were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule, and as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Pumpkin, Russia captured key regions including Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, something Russian czars had coveted for generations. These victories weren't just military, they were symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a message. Russia was no longer the distant, backward cousin of Europe. It was a continental force. She also turned her gaze westward. In a series of deals and diplomatic maneuvers, Catherine participated in the partitions of Poland, carving up the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, along with Austria and Prussia. By the end of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland was erased from the map and Russia claimed vast new lands and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't just conquer with armies. She also colonized with ideas. New cities were built. Trade routes were expanded. German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian farmland. The empire became a mosaic from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea. And through it all, Catherine remained the central force, reading reports, issuing orders, and personally overseeing the shape of her expanding empire. Critics would accuse her of being power-hungry, even imperialistic. But to Catherine, expansion wasn't ambition. It was destiny. A great ruler she believed was measured not just by ideas, but by borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it as a civilized empire feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and loyal to her alone. For all her brilliance and power, Catherine the Great was just as famous for what went on behind palace doors. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Catherine's private life became one of the most talked about aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully curated parade of them, many decades younger, often handsome, and sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they behaved well. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most important of these lovers was Gregory Pumpkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Together, they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Pumpkin wasn't just a lover. He was her co-ruler in many ways. Still, Europe couldn't look past the scandal. Gossip swirled, satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, even unhinged. And after her death, the rumors only got. Worse, the most infamous being the completely false and grotesque tale involving a horse spread by her enemies to smear her legacy. But why the obsession simple? Catherine was a woman who wielded power unapologetically, and in a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play the role she lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms, and that made her dangerous, ironically, while her critics painted her. If you found this enlightening, please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe with the bell on for more eye-opening history content. Until next time, stay curious, stay grateful, and enjoy the modern world around you. Goodbye.